Welcome back to Remake or Rebreak, Metroid II Revisited. In part 1, I gave my updated thoughts on the original game for the Game Boy. Today, we're going to discuss one of the best fan games ever made, AM2R Return of Samus for the PC. Back when I was first getting into the series in the late aughts, I wasn't particularly interested in playing the Game Boy version of Metroid 2, and decided to see if someone had already given it the Zero Mission treatment. That's when I discovered that a fan by the name of Milton Huasti, aka Dr. M64, was developing another Metroid 2 remake, or AM2R for short. Over the next 7 years or so, I watched the project progress from a one-person operation to a small team of fans working together to deliver an ambitious passion project. Nowadays, the franchise is in a relatively safe spot, with Dread surpassing sales expectations and Metroid Prime 4 in active development. Because of that, it's easy to forget that the franchise went through a drought period after Other M released in 2010. Things only got worse when Nintendo finally broke the silence with Federation Force in 2015, which didn't go so well. After Other M shook the community's faith in the franchise and in series producer / Other M writer Yoshio Sakamoto, the fans were looking for a return to form. Not a co-op shooter on 3DS of all platforms. Yes, Federation Force was the brainchild of Prime producer Kensuke Tanabe, not Sakamoto. In fact, during this time, Sakamoto was actually working really hard to get a traditional Metroid game greenlit, with Samus Returns starting development sometime that year. For the record, I actually thought Federation Force was pretty good, but it's obvious to me that it was the wrong game at the wrong time. While Nintendo was seemingly neglecting the series, AM2R launched and gave fans exactly what they had been asking for: a new Metroid game with traditional gameplay. Fan project or not, AM2R carved out an enduring legacy in the series' history, so I will be including it in this marathon for that reason. Soon after the game came out, Dr. M64 released V1.1, essentially a hotfix for major bugs in V1.0 and the first in a line of planned updates. Not long afterwards, Nintendo retaliated by sending a DMCA directly to Dr. M64, leading him to cease development and cancel all updates. The good news is that Dr. M64's experiences with AM2R helped him to get a job at Moon Studios, where he was one of the level designers for Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Bottom line, Dr. M64 has a broad skill set in design, programming, and sound engineering, and I'm glad a major studio recognized his hard work and talents. About a month after the game's release, one of AM2R's writers, Latin Lingo, published a blog post detailing some of the features Dr. M64 and company had planned to add to later updates. These included a more open New Game Plus mode, charge combos, additional gallery pictures, new lore entries, a secret message in the genetics lab, a secret post-credit scene, and even some unused enemies. Soon after, Dr. M64 released a remastered soundtrack, stating he had planned to add it to V1.2. Unfortunately, due to Nintendo's DMCA, these updates would forever languish on the cutting room floor. Or would they? Some time after the project ceased development, the project's source was eventually reverse engineered by Yellow Afterlife. From here, a new team known as the AM2R Community Developers picked up the mantle and began committing bug fixes and adding some of the features Latin Lingo referred to in his blog post. The result of these efforts was V1.2, released roughly a year after Dr. M64 ceased development. From here, the community began polishing the new stuff and eventually added completely original features of their own. Because of that, we'll be looking at two builds in today's review. Version 1.1, the last release that Dr. M64 had direct involvement in, and version 1.5.5, the most recent update as of writing. While I will be comparing these two releases to show off the new updates, I want to focus on what I consider to be major changes. If you're looking for a more exhaustive list, feel free to check out the changelog available with the launcher. The last time I covered AM2R, I was extremely positive, but now that the excitement and drama of the game's release has faded away, how well does the game hold up to a fresh playthrough? Second, as a remake, how well does AM2R improve and add to the original? Finally, to what extent have the post-release updates from the new team improved the overall experience? This is AM2R Remake or Rebreak Revisited. Before I begin, I recommend that everyone interested in AM2R should download the latest version of the launcher, which is V2.3.0 as of writing. You're also going to need a clean zip of AM2R V1.1, which the launcher will patch over to the latest version. I apologize, but you're going to have to find the V1.1 zip on your own. Regardless, the launcher streamlines the overall user experience. Once you've set it up, you're all set for future updates. The launcher also allows allows you to adjust patch settings, review the changelog, manage mods, and set up special profiles. Bottom line, the launcher is great, and with future updates, I imagine it will only get better. As far as I've experienced, the launcher is safe and secure, but if you do choose to download it or a 1.1 zip, you do so at your own risk. I won't accept responsibility for any unfortunate consequences. AM2R begins with an opening cinematic inspired by the opening of Super Metroid, which essentially covers everything that was in the manual. The foreshortening on Samus's hand looks a bit strange here, but other than that, this opening serves its purpose and adds production value the Game Boy version didn't have. Story-wise, AM2R adds an automated lore system inspired by the Prime trilogy, written by Ridley in Latin lingo. Whenever you enter a new area or fight a new boss, a new entry is added to the pause menu. These codex entries reflect the quality standard of the Prime games and prove that flavor text can work in a 2D Metroid game very easily. Given that viewing these is optional, it just makes you wonder why the main games never attempted something similar. The lore does an excellent job fleshing out the reimagined locations and gives you a sense of how all these Chozo facilities mesh together, while also chronicling the escalating threat of each Metroid mutation. The Federation Research Expedition and Federation Rescue Team, which were both mentioned in the manual, make concrete appearances in AM2R that propel the story. In the original, Area 4 was just a pointless detour with one gamma that you could probably cut without losing anything substantial. AM2R, meanwhile, uses this area to escalate the tension by showcasing the remains of the research team, reminding you that these easy mini-bosses are still a galactic threat that you should take seriously. This is intensified when you're ambushed by two alphas at once, whereas in the original, you only ever fought one Metroid at a time. You still fight the first Omega and the familiar ring trap in Area 8. This time, however, you stumble across the Federation Rescue Team, which is effortlessly slaughtered by the Omega in a matter of seconds. You learn firsthand just how powerful the Omegas really are and discover through gameplay that Samus is the only one strong enough to stop them. Compare this to Samus Returns, where you matter-of-factly stumble across the remains of the Federation expedition within the first 5 minutes, and it's clear AM2R made much better use of this plot point. While the story is still in the background compared to the gameplay, the ludonarrative synchronicity is much stronger here, giving the Metroids and SR388 a much more hostile, desolate, and intimidating presence compared to the original. Generally speaking, the overall story hasn't changed much by the latest version, with a few exceptions. A new 100% post-credit scene shows the X-Parasites emerging from the crystal blocks and attacking a Hornode, a great bit of retroactive continuity that geniusly ties the events of the second and fourth games together. Interestingly enough, this cutscene was planned before Samus Returns ever came out, so the fact that they both have a scene like this is just coincidence. On a similar note, the Metroid hatchling scene has been updated. In V1.1, you can actually run past it while it's hatching and it will just follow you. As of V1.3.2, a brief cutscene inspired by Super Metroid will play where Samus will aim at the hatchling before choosing to spare it, an appreciated nod to establish continuity. Once Samus lands on SR388, we get a face full of the new visuals created by these talented folks here. AM2R V1.1 runs at 320 by 240, a substantial upgrade over the GBA games and even Super Metroid. The game has a scale feature that lets you play it either stretched or at an integer scale, which I appreciate. The only problem is that the integer scale only goes up to 4 times, and if you have a high resolution monitor, that's not going to fill up the whole screen. Thankfully, you can set whatever scale factor you want directly in the INI and it will work. In any event, many re-releases completely neglect an option for integer scales or even aspect ratios, so I appreciate that this essential feature is included at all. Which leads me to the first noteworthy difference between V1.1 and the latest version: widescreen. Enabling this feature increases the resolution to 426 by 240, making the game wider. I wasn't expecting much from this feature given that each room is proportioned for 4:3, but it works surprisingly well. The areas outside of doors either resemble their counterparts in the following screen or are covered with walls and centered in frame. The extra visibility and use of screen space is great, and you can always go back to 4:3 if you prefer. Consequently, I recorded all of my V1.5.5 footage in widescreen to make it easier to tell which version is which. Since I can't think of a better time to mention this, earlier versions of AM2R contain an interesting performance bug that can cause intermittent frame drops in some machines. Lead programmer Loji Miru tells me that this is an issue inherent to AM2R's engine, GameMaker Studio 1.4, and results from the the engine's sleep margin. As of V1.5.3, AM2R includes an options.ini and instructions for adjusting the sleep margin. Logimiru tells me that the default setting of 10 works best on most machines, though I personally got the best results with 13. In terms of the actual visuals, AM2R V1.1 takes heavy inspiration from Zero Mission, to the point that many sprites and tile sets appear to be ripped and recolored from the GBA games. Most of the graphics are completely new, namely the enemy sprites. The art team did an excellent job reinterpreting the Game Boy sprites into something more detailed while preserving the spirit of the original. At first I thought Arachnus and Ceres used their fusion sprite sets, but on closer inspection there are some minor differences to the shading and proportions. The environments have similarly seen a massive visual overhaul. The Golden Temple remains loyal to the premise of the original Area 1 in Metroid II, only now it resembles Chozodia from Zero Mission. AM2R shakes off the repetitive theming of the original by reimagining the other temples as various Chozo facilities. Area 2 is now a water distribution network, Area 3 becomes an assembly plant for all the robots encountered throughout the game, and Area 6 is reimagined as a weapons testing facility suspended above a geothermal power plant. There's also a brand new area called the Distribution Center where electricity is packaged in orbs and delivered to other facilities by Crocomire-shaped drones. In addition to the other smaller areas I've mentioned already, Area 5 has become a cordite mining quarry littered with the super missile destructibles from the Prime games. Unlike the flat, solid color backdrops of most of the Game Boy version, AM2R features layered parallax backgrounds with tons of atmosphere and detail. Even compared to the GBA games, these backgrounds are a huge improvement. I think the best example is the cavernous dome surrounding the Golden Temple. While the original Area 1 just feels like it's floating in an empty void, AM2R showcases a temple carved into a mountainside, with the sky visible through cracks in the eroded cavern walls. It adds a lot of immersion and environmental storytelling through visuals alone. While the environment art looks pretty good, it doesn't always match the Zero Mission inspiration as well as it could. For one thing, the newer tile sets use noticeably darker tones with lower contrast, which clashes somewhat with the garish high contrast environments inspired by the GBA games. My only real criticism of the art is the reinterpretations for Zetas and Omegas. The actual pixel art looks great like the rest of the game, but the use of sprite rotation makes the animations look a bit stiff. Personally, I prefer the Fusion and Zero Mission approach of using different frames of animation for multi-sprite characters. Speaking of the visuals, they represent the most noticeable differences in the updated versions. As part of the recent updates, a new art team completely redrew many enemy, NPC, and pickup sprites. Notable changes include the addition of an animated title screen, redesigns for the rescue team to better resemble the Prime 3 Federation troopers, tubes on the Queen's back, and a more scaly, reptilian-looking Ceres. On top of that, one of the most conspicuous visual bugs in V1.1 has been fixed. Gravity Suit Samus's leg used to constantly twitch in mid-air while jumping, but now behaves correctly as of V1.2. Another detail I really appreciate is the addition of title cards that appear whenever you enter a new facility, which, oddly enough, calls back to the opening of Other M. So why make these changes when the graphics in V1.1 were already complete? According to lead programmer Logimiru, the graphical overhaul is part of an ongoing effort by the community to remove assets directly ripped from or heavily resembling official Metroid assets. Their goal is to give AM2R a more distinct visual identity and put the game in a better moral standing with Nintendo. Thus far, the visual overhaul hasn't extended to the environment art, which appears virtually identical to V1.1. Given that the color scheme of the GBA-inspired tile sets tend to clash with the darker shades of the original tile sets, I suspect this effort will also give the game more visual consistency. In addition to the new visuals, AM2R V1.1 also features a completely new soundtrack, which was arranged by Dr. M64 himself alongside Darren Kerwin and Torbjorn Brandrud. The soundscape is very Metroid Prime, with a lot of choral lines and unconventional sci-fi tones. When it comes to remixing tracks from the original game, the sound team didn't just update the orchestration, but also took the time to update the compositions with droning harmonic regressions and overlapping melodic textures. Yoshitomi's more melodious pieces translate wonderfully to Yamamoto's Prime aesthetic. Highlights include the main theme, which gives off a forlorn and ancient atmosphere while retaining the adventurous spirit of the original piece. The Golden Temple, which offers a livelier composition without sacrificing the original's mysterious edge. and the Metroid Larva's theme, which is one of the most haunting yet harmonious tracks in any Metroid game. Meanwhile, Yoshitomi's more avant-garde pieces have been reimagined from 8-bit chaos to something more listenable. The Metroid boss theme especially benefits from the choral orchestration and the added percussion. On that note, each Metroid mutation sports its own arrangement, with the tension increasing with each evolution. All the ambient tracks from the original game are accentuated with crumbling rocks and scampering wildlife. Instead of remixing these ambient pieces for the later temples, Dr. M64 elected to replace them with rearranged pieces from other Metroid games. These include an aquatic arrangement of Upper Brinstar from Super, the Light Temple from Echoes, and an up-tempo techno version of Lower Norfair from Super Metroid. These additions help to flesh out the soundtrack somewhat over the original game. On that note, AM2R contains several original pieces as well, including the Federation areas and a couple new boss themes. Stylistically, these depart somewhat from the Prime aesthetic, but still sound appropriately Metroid. Meanwhile, the new Distribution Center's music was composed by Dr. M64 and Torbjorn Brandrud and fits Metroid like a glove. I especially love the atmospheric arrangement that plays before you reactivate the center. It sounds like an unused track from Metroid Prime in all the right ways. While I enjoy most of the soundtrack, the one track that maybe didn't turn out so well is the Arachnus boss theme. But really, that's the only track I can point to and say I didn't like, compared to roughly half of the original soundtrack. Interestingly, the Arachnus boss theme highlights a key difference between V1.1 and the latest version. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. M64 released an updated soundtrack after ceasing development, stating it would have been added to version 1.2. Thanks to the efforts of Metroid Brothers 27574, these remastered tracks are now included in the game itself. Later on, a fan called Nintendo Maniac 64 uncovered a high dynamic range version of the soundtrack and made that available in-game as well. Now, when you patch the game through the launcher, you have a choice between the V1.1 soundtrack and the high dynamic range V1.2 soundtrack. The Arachnus boss theme improves the most in the V1.2 soundtrack. There are some other improvements as well, such as the Golden Temple sounding a little more bassy. As well as the addition of a synth line in the Hydro Station. Overall, the 1.2 soundtrack isn't radically different, but generally the changes are for the best. Seeing as Dr. M64 was a professional sound engineer for many years, the overall sound design is unsurprisingly strong. Combat feedback from the robot enemies stands out as especially crunchy and visceral. There are also some great touches, like how you can hear the Queen's distant roars from as far back as the first Omega fight, or how the Metroid grunts gradually deepen with each mutation. My one nitpick is that while some of the sound effects are high quality clips, others were ripped directly from the GBA games, and the difference in sound fidelity can be pretty striking. Generally speaking, the sound design in the latest version is nigh identical, though there are a few tweaks. Most noteworthy, the missile, super missile, and power bomb pickup sounds are more reminiscent of their Zero Mission equivalents. Samus has also received a slower paced spin jump sound while navigating underwater areas without the gravity suit. Moving on to core gameplay, AM2R does for Metroid II what Zero Mission did for the first game. In fact, the controls and physics are virtually identical to Zero Mission, from directional aiming to ledge grabbing to wall jumping. This is especially impressive considering Dr. M64 recreated the physics and controls from scratch. What's also nice is that the controls are fully reassignable with lots of options. You can choose from super and fusion style missile switching and diagonal aiming, as well as 2D versus 3D style morph ball activation, and 3 different spider ball control types. While Zero Mission virtually perfected the 2D Metroid control scheme, Dr. M64 nevertheless made several quality of life improvements to make it that much better. Samus can now auto-climb small ledges by walking up to them and pressing jump, and the moonwalk from Super Metroid has been reimagined similar to the aim lock from the Prime games. Personally, I only really found the aim lock useful for the Chorizo boss in the early alphas, but hey, options are great. You can also perform a 5-line bomb jump by charging, morphing, and releasing while holding down. I tend to forget that it's a thing, and in retrospect I should have used it a lot more. My favorite tweak, however, is that the morph ball doesn't bounce as much when landing from a great height, which can increase movement speed in cases unsuitable for the speed booster. It sounds small, but once you've mastered this, it can really tighten up the pacing. Between all of these improvements, AM2R has easily the best controls in any Metroid game to date, though we'll see how I feel once I replay Dread for that review. After slowly floating through 5 playthroughs of Metroid II and stiffly navigating 4 playthroughs of Samus Returns, I popped in AM2R again for a bit and instantly felt in complete and total control. If I had to nitpick anything, I find that infinite bomb jumping isn't quite accurate to Zero Mission, but that's about it. Thankfully, with the spider ball, you won't really need IBJs unless you're sequence breaking or playing the randomizer. Since I can't think of a better time to mention this, the camera and visibility are usually quite good in AM2R, but there are occasions where the camera will unceremoniously jerk around. Thankfully, this happens rarely enough that I almost forgot to mention it. Like the GBA games, beam upgrades all stack together, combining each beam's properties into one weapon. Interestingly, AM2R also brings back toggleable beams from Super Metroid. So, for example, if you want to use just the Spacer beam, you can. Interestingly, each beam besides the ice beam appears to do the same amount of damage, so you're stacking them purely for the side effects of each permutation, which means that you can sacrifice the wall piercing of the wave beam for the faster rate of fire of the plasma beam without reducing damage per shot. This preserves the playstyle-oriented beam system from the original while offering the convenience of the stacking system from Super Metroid, and that's pretty cool. Much like Zero Mission, every upgrade from the original game returns, along with super missiles, the charge beam, the speed booster, power bombs, and the gravity suit. The ice beam is replaced with the charge beam and moved to the distribution center along with the screw attack. Since the ice beam is unlocked so late, you can't really use it for platforming. But given you unlocked the spider ball so early, it wasn't useful for that in the original anyway. Besides, it totally makes up for it by insta-freezing most regular enemies, making for a powerful late-game weapon. Even the gravity suit sees a little more justice. While Zero Mission had to contrive a few perfunctory expansions to justify including it, AM2R gives it a concrete use case with the flooded lower floors of the distribution center. The core combat is as good as it's been since Super Metroid, and AM2R brings back all the familiar SR388 creepy crawlies, each behaving similarly to their Game Boy counterparts. My favorite is still the Sawblade Cactus, though this time he better resembles the insectoid design from the original manual. In addition to returning enemies, AM2R features new enemy concepts to fight as well, and they fit within the universe and art design as well as they could. Interestingly, 2 major enemies from the Game Boy version were designed but unused in V1.1, Septogs and Blob Throwers. Both of these enemies were later implemented in V1.4, the former being used as stepping stones for the randomizer and the latter acting as an encouragement to unlock the high jump. Though they barely appear in a normal playthrough, I definitely felt their absence after playing the original so many times. Unsurprisingly, the Metroid Minibosses return as well, and unfortunately, this is the one thing about AM2R that didn't hold up as well as I remembered. The basic principle of alphas and gammas are the same. They fly around and try to ram you, with gammas being able to shoot electricity. However, these forms also feature new behaviors to make them more than just missile sponges. While the first few alphas are basically identical to their Game Boy counterparts, later on you'll face long-legged alphas that will attempt to dodge some of your shots and even charge at you from a distance. Gammas will now try to grab you with their legs and electrocute you. While Zetas and Omegas on Game Boy were basically reskins of the Gamma with more health, here they've been redesigned to reflect the ground-bound Omega from Metroid Fusion. They'll swipe at you with their claws, throw their weight around, and spit projectiles at you. Overall, these Metroid evolutions are an improvement, staying true to the spirit of the original game while making the fights faster paced and more dynamic. Unfortunately, there are a few design choices that tend to make Metroids in this game more tedious than anything. Before I get into that, I should note that making a good set of recurring mini-bosses is a difficult design challenge in the first place. You need to make something simple and straightforward enough that players won't get sick of fighting it multiple times, while also making something with enough substance that players will still find each bout engaging. In that respect, the best approach is to make something that's kind of challenging in the first couple bouts, but that the player can clear quickly later on with an informed strategy, which makes each mini-boss feel rewarding even as they get easier. With that in mind, the biggest problem with the Metroid mini-bosses in AM2R is that the informed strategy that should make repeated fights faster and more satisfying actually makes the game slower and more boring. The biggest reason for that is AM2R Metroids are only vulnerable in the membrane, whereas on Game Boy they were vulnerable in the face as well. This can get especially frustrating with gammas, which have a nasty habit of moving out of your firing line at the last second. On top of that, the membrane seems much bigger than the actual hurt box, meaning that shots that look like they should have landed will sometimes bounce off harmlessly. Thankfully, later updates revised the gamma collision to make the membrane easier to hit, and in my experience, this makes gammas less frustrating to fight while adhering to the spirit of Dr. M64's original design. I imagine the removal of the face weak point was done for balancing reasons, seeing as Samus is much faster and can now aim diagonally. On lower difficulties, I think it's generally fine, but once you get into hard or fusion mode, the more defensive boss designs can turn Metroids into a recurring pace breaker. Because of that, I tended to fall back into dominant strategy for the first three forms. For dodgy alphas and early gammas, I jump in place to kite them upwards, spam missiles diagonally, and hope they hit. Both alpha types receive a massive speed boost on higher difficulties, to the point that trying to intentionally aim and shoot at the membrane is humanly impossible. Because of that, your only real hope is to get the alpha into a good rhythm or jam them against a wall, which isn't as easy as it sounds. Since gammas are so defensive and difficult to hit while moving, the best strategy is to wait for them to stop to shoot electricity and hit them with 2 super missiles. But if you don't have enough, eventually you're gonna have to fall back on spamming missiles and hoping they hit. Seeing as Zetas and Omegas can't fly, they're a bit of a different story. Zetas will start blocking every other shot after reaching half health in normal mode and will do so from the start on higher difficulties. Consequently, the dominant strategy on higher difficulties is to fire while Zeta is jumping or vomiting, during which they won't block your shots. Unfortunately, you need 6 super missiles to defeat a Zeta quickly, and given expansions are worth less on higher difficulties, the strategy tends to devolve into spamming missiles and hoping they land. Hopefully by now you see what I'm getting at with Metroids not holding up to repeat playthroughs. Generally, the design incentivizes waiting around for a surefire moment to strike, or mindlessly spamming missiles and hoping the Metroid dies before you do. Neither is very satisfying to pull off, and they get boring and frustrating very quickly. Fortunately, the Omega fares much better as a repeating mini-boss and provides a good template for how the other forms could improve. For one thing, the membrane is bigger and easier to hit compared to previous forms, meaning you don't have to wait around as much for the boss to become vulnerable. Moreover, the obscure back trick from the original has been reimagined as this tiny weak spot that opens after the Omega jumps. If you can manage to hit it, you'll do massive damage, which is satisfying to pull off. Overall, Omegas reward players for playing the game well, whereas alphas and gammas tend to punish them for not playing well enough, and Zetas are tedious no matter what you do. Unfortunately, the Queen herself isn't much to write home about either. I'll credit AM2R for staying loyal to the attack set of the original fight, and the way the Queen bursts through walls and pursues you makes the fight more dynamic and exciting. Plus, the obscure bomb trick from the original has been reimagined into an optional original finisher that's much more intuitive. Unfortunately, the boss is also much longer than the original, which was repetitive in one note to begin with. Couple an inflated health pool with the fact the boss is invulnerable about 50% of the time, and the overall pacing really suffers. Thankfully, the other bosses are pretty good and a big improvement over Zero Mission. In that game, you never really had to learn the boss patterns in the lower difficulties since you could get away with tanking everything. While AM2R still isn't especially difficult on normal, I found myself actually having to learn the rhythm of each boss, which I suppose is one benefit to the more defensive Metroid designs. Getting into specifics, this is easily my favorite version of Arachnus I've played so far. Trying to lay bombs in time to launch Arachnus into the shock coils is fast-paced, frenetic fun. The only boss I can think of to try anything remotely similar is probably the Spider Guardian, but this is much better paced. In addition to Arachnus, AM2R introduces a host of new bosses to complement the Metroid horde. The Ancient Guardian is a highlight of the early game. Dodging its simple but effective attacks is a lot of fun, and the contracting spiked walls really ramp up the tension. The Torizo returns from Super Metroid for a standard boss in the first phase, before testing your aerial mobility in the second phase. Next up, the Tester turns your weapons against you, while also incorporating verticality in a way I haven't seen in a Metroid game before. The only drawback is that because of the collapsing platforms, the boss is off screen a lot of the time. Finally, we have Samus, who behaves similarly to its fusion counterpart, only this time you have to use the Ice Beam to freeze and destroy parts of its body. In addition, there's also a completely original boss fight on the GFS Thoth called the Genesis that's tense and atmospheric, but ultimately pretty one note. You just shoot him till he dies. So, while the Metroids are somewhat disappointing, AM2R's main bosses improve on Zero Missions with interesting attack sets and a decent level of challenge. Jumping back to the latest version, many of the boss fights have received changes by V1.5.5. First off, the changelog details minor rebalancing for many bosses. The tank mini-boss is the most notable example, and has also received new ice and wave beam attacks in addition to the plasma beam from V1.1. The tank even moves faster in hard mode and above. The Samus, which in retrospect felt kind of under-designed in V1.1, will now perform the speed boost like it did in Fusion after taking enough damage. More recently, these electric capsules have been added to the walls similar to the Dragon boss in Super Metroid. If you can get Samus to collide with the destroyed cap, you can damage the boss or get it to stop speed boosting sooner. It adds some finesse, but personally, I just exploited a blind spot in the AI and waited him out. Finally, the Queen has received a new attack seemingly inspired by her counterpart in Samus Returns. In the second to last phase, she'll vomit up green sludge, which adds a little more variance to an otherwise repetitive fight. On top of that, as of V1.3, the music will fade out at points and switch between normal, percussive, and combined renditions. Given the repetitive composition, the use of vertical layering makes the fight feel much more dynamic. In terms of difficulties, V1.1 presents a choice between easy, normal, and hard. Based on my observations, hard mode appears to double the HP and damage of standard enemies over normal mode, with a few also receiving new behaviors. Similar to Zero Mission, expansions have been reduced in size. Missile tanks are worth 2 rounds, while Super Missile and Power Bomb tanks are only worth 1. Unlike Zero Mission, however, energy tanks are still worth a whole 100 units. Metroids on hard mode all receive a damage buff, but appear to have the same amount of health, most likely because they're only vulnerable to missile attacks. As I mentioned in my Zeta discussion, there are some minor behavioral differences as well. From my experience though, Gammas and Omegas don't really change much apart from double damage output. Interestingly, the number of larval Metroids in the genetics lab increases on hard mode and increases again on fusion mode. Historically, I considered the Torizo a massive difficulty spike on hard mode. However, upon recording V1.5.5 footage for this review, I discovered that you can apparently morph ball under its legs and make a fool out of its first phase. Even so, this guy can be kind of a brick wall on fusion mode. So if you're desperate, you might consider using the IBJ to get into the temple early and unlock a few extra pickups. In V1.4, the community developers introduced a new difficulty, fusion mode, inspired by the secret difficulty in Samus Returns that Nintendo hid behind an amiibo paywall. Yes, I am still bitter. In both games, fusion mode sees you playing as Fusion Suit Samus, and you can even choose between two palettes lifted from Fusion and Samus Returns. Like that game, Fusion mode presents the hardest difficulty of the bunch. Enemy damage has been quadrupled over normal mode, though health pools for enemies appear unaffected and expansion sizes are the same as hard mode. Unlike Samus Returns, the AM2R Fusion Suit is more than just a cosmetic. All organic enemies are infected by X parasites, meaning the absorption mechanic from Fusion returns as well. The same thing extends to bosses with organic components. Defeating them will spawn a Core X mini-boss, which will sometimes award you suit upgrades in place of item drops. While a small change, Core X's did add some tension to boss encounters since I always forgot they were coming. Robotic enemies and bosses, meanwhile, simply drop pickups like they did in lower difficulties. Metroid behaviors appear identical to hard mode, though strangely enough, they now have a more dark bluish color scheme than before. Unfortunately, I found each Metroid nest to be a colossal pain in the butt, which was sort of an issue in hard mode, but especially agonizing in Fusion mode. Coupling Fusion mode stats with hard mode behaviors means a single Metroid can drain your health quickly in the early game. Consequently, I found myself having to backtrack to the save station between fights to keep my health and ammo stocked and avoid losing progress, which is especially painful in the Area 3 Gamma nest. It was either that or risk getting a game over and having to fight everything all over again. Frankly, it just made me wish that there were more recharge stations or at least a good spot to farm. Without them, these areas just become a war of attrition. While the first half of the game can be brutal thanks to the Metroid balancing, by the second half you've built up your reserves and the game really doesn't feel that much different from hard mode. While it can be frustrating, Fusion mode is optional and the whole point was to be brutal, so I won't judge it too harshly. My point is that Fusion mode isn't really for me, and I'll probably stick to hard mode from now on. With most of the gameplay covered, let's talk about the level design. As opposed to the crisscrossing progression of most Metroid games, AM2R preserves the linear structure and core game loop of the original game. You come across an open-ended Chozo facility and defeat all the Metroids, which triggers an earthquake, lowers the lava, and allows you to progress to the next area. Like Zero Mission, the shape of the game world is strikingly faithful to the original game, though there have been some minor tweaks to fit the map into one contiguous plane. This is because the original game cheated by overlapping certain hallways and shafts, which is probably one of the reasons the original didn't have a map. Overall though, those changes are minimal and the areas remain recognizable to their Game Boy counterparts. While AM2R remains loyal to the original game in the macro, individual rooms have been considerably overhauled to improve the design. While all the unique and memorable rooms from the original game are accounted for, the recycled rooms and hallways now have a more distinct layout. Returning room layouts see the addition of a new puzzle element, a new expansion that wasn't there before, or some other innovation to make it fresh and interesting. Meanwhile, the less interesting rooms see an overhaul in platform and enemy placement to make the moment-to-moment gameplay more interesting. Long gone are the days of walking and hopping through bland, samey corridors with minimal enemy resistance. Now, there's always something new to discover even if you've already played the original. In addition to improving rooms in terms of base mechanics, AM2R takes inspiration from the overhauled visual theming to add new obstacles and set pieces. For example, the Hydro Station adds pumps, turbines, and pipe circuits while reimagining the tall vertical pipes as geyser tunnels. While the Area 3 temple was basically just a few hallways suspended above a Metroid nest, the industrial complex recreates the temple rooms while adding several lower floors covered in machinery and conveyor belts. As for the nest, the lower floors are now shrouded in darkness with new room layouts to complement the claustrophobic atmosphere. Perhaps the most significant design overhaul occurs in the tower. Now that the player can switch beams through the menu, the beam tower from the original Area 6 is functionally moot. Consequently, the tower features a completely new layout, with the only returning room being the plasma beam statue. Even the dark tunnel, which was a miserable nightmare in the original, pulls off the disorienting and claustrophobic concept considerably better, all while delivering an engaging morph ball sequence. Similar to the ceiling handles in Kraid's lair, AM2R also adds its share of completely original gameplay ideas and contextual progression. First off, there are a few switches you can shoot to activate certain machinery in the Golden Temple. Next up are these power orb things from the distribution center. Basically, you shoot bombs or missiles to bounce them into slots and activate nearby doors. I appreciate the added puzzle solving, and I've gotten better at it over time, but it's still a bit annoying that the orbs can go through doors and reset the puzzle on a whim. Overall, these sections are decent. My favorite bit of new gameplay is where you control the Autod, who dodges machinery while picking up and dropping super missiles. It's a bit clunky, but there's enough finesse to doing it quickly to make it interesting. My least favorite of the new gameplay, if I can even call it that is the part where Samus activates a giant drill to excavate the cordite mines. I would have preferred a section where the drill moves on its own, and you have to pilot your morph ball around in the meantime to help the drill get to the end faster. Speaking of parts I didn't like, the worst part of the game is where you fight a Gamma in this room, which is pitch black with only a small glimmer of visibility. I already didn't like Gammas that much when I could actually see them, so you can imagine how I felt about this room. Unfortunately, despite all the improvements to the level design of the temple areas, the final jaunt towards the Queen's lair is still a giant serpentine hallway where you walk, occasionally jump, and walk some more. Nothing but standard platforming and combat, no puzzles, and only 2 Metroids along the way. Thankfully, this time, there are at least a few expansions to find, a handful of secret shortcuts, and faster movement with the morph ball and speed booster. There's also a convenient shortcut after the fact that leads back to the Hydro Station, so if you miss something, you don't have to backtrack through the corridor again. Like Zero Mission before it, the returning areas in AM2R successfully thread the needle between faithfully reproducing the original level design and reimagining SR388 for modern sensibilities. Speaking of Zero Mission, AM2R also features some brand new areas never featured in the original game. First up is a brand new temple area called the Distribution Center. I appreciate how this area uses water and has a more interweaved design than the previous temples. Structurally, it reminds me a lot of Norfair from Zero Mission. The use of vacuum tubes for fast travel between chunks of the facility adds a fresh bit of contextual progression and works well with the established systems. I also enjoy how once you unlock the screw attack, you can break through walls and open shortcuts. I do find these saw blades are surprisingly tanky for what they are, but thankfully you can make quick work of them once you unlock the screw attack. Next up is an all-new power plant area underneath the tower in Area 6. While a standard romp at first, AM2R throws a curveball with a surprise escape sequence, which was noticeably absent in the original Metroid II. Unlike other games, there's seemingly no hard time limit, making for an anxiety-inducing race for the exit, with the tension only increasing when a surprise Chozo tank shows up to stall your escape. Finally, there's the Thoth landing site on the surface, which is sort of like Crateria from Zero Mission. One detail I really like is that both of the ship designs are lifted directly from the Prime games. Now, while the V1.1 Thoth is basically an atmospheric romp to the Genesis boss, V1.4 adds the lore entries that Latin Lingo teased all the way back in 2016. These new entries help to better reconcile Metroid II's spot in the series, heavily referencing plot points from both Fusion and the Prime series. Now, if only the official games weren't so wishy-washy about what the continuity is supposed to be. Speaking of the new Thoth entries, Latin Lingo also made good on another idea he teased in his 2016 forum post. Similar to Echoes, you can read personal log entries written by fallen Federation troopers. These new entries were a collaboration between Latin Lingo and a new writer named I Want Devil. It's kind of interesting to view the Metroid menace from outside of Samus's perspective, and these entries have a more naturalistic flow than the ones from Echoes. With the rest of the gameplay covered, how is the 100% experience in AM2R? One thing I can say is that collecting expansions is a blast. There's always some kind of great puzzle, or tricky morph ball section, or some kind of interesting use of your mechanics, all of which make adding another missile tank to your collection that much more rewarding. Shine Spark puzzles return, but they are thankfully much less numerous and much more forgiving than they were in Zero Mission especially, all the while still rewarding skillful play. The drawback is that unlike the original, AM2R has a handful of expansions that require suit upgrades from later areas or launching the orbs in the distribution center. While I generally don't like in-game cleanup as a rule, the power orb rooms give you something substantially new to justify the revisit, and there is the new Thoth area to explore along the way. Plus, AM2R adds these high-speed vacuum tubes to quickly travel between temples. While any percenters probably won't use them that much outside of New Game Plus or the randomizer, the fast travel gives completionists more routing options. Overall, the 100% experience is above average for the series in terms of the number of backtrack expansions relative to how long it takes. Helping the full completion experience is that AM2R greatly improves the navigation with the addition of a full-fledged map with all the bells and whistles of the GBA games. Interestingly, Dr. M64 managed to fit the whole game world into a single contiguous map, similar to the Castlevania games, with convenient color coding to visually separate each area. While the HUD Metroid counter can be set between local or global, the map screen will show both while also marking Metroid locations for future reference. So while on Game Boy I always end up getting lost trying to find the last Gamma in Area 3, the map in AM2R makes that scenario virtually impossible. Now, for those who enjoy drawing their own maps when playing Metroid 1 and 2, good news everyone! You can actually turn off the HUD map and draw your own if you really really want to, which is kind of neat. Personally, I prefer the convenience of an auto map, but this way everyone's happy. There's only one major problem with the map in V1.1, which I noted in my original review. There's no completion percentage in the pause menu, or even the unlockable expansion counters from the GBA games. You either have to know the exact amount of ammo you'll have for each weapon, or quit to the title screen. By 2016, a simple completion percentage on the map just seems like common sense, especially after the Prime games made it standard. Now, to give credit to Dr. M64, he heard this criticism in my original episode on AM2R and promised to fix it. Thankfully, when the AM2R Community Developers picked up the mantle, Doc's promise was honored as of V1.2. The map screen now features a completion percentage as well as item counters for each expansion type. Even better, you can get the percentage to show up under the minimap through a combination of settings. As a reviewer, I would like to express my heartfelt appreciation for the addition of these features. Now that I've covered most of the game, I'd like to talk about some of the other new features from recent updates that I haven't discussed yet. Those feeling nostalgic for the Game Boy version can enable an 8-bit shader, which features several Game Boy Color inspired palettes as well as a custom palette. It looks better than I expected, especially considering it's just a fun bonus feature. Unfortunately, given that it compresses a wider color gamut into only 4 tones, the darker areas of the game can border on unplayable. Similarly, it's impossible to predict the Ancient Guardian's attacks, since its eyes will always appear as the same color. The shader is pretty neat, but for those reasons I'd prefer to play the game without it. Another noteworthy addition is the reintroduction of the low health alarm from the original Game Boy game, which can be toggled in the options menu. For the speedrunners in the audience, one great convenience is an in-game timer for the HUD, which is great for practicing. Another fun cosmetic is the ability to turn on the Metroid hatchling for the whole game. Funnily enough, if you do this during fusion mode, the hatchling will chase after floating X-parasites. Speaking of larvae, those looking for an extra challenge in the genetics lab can enable Extreme Lab Metroids, which cranks the number of larvae up to 47 across difficulties and gives them a damage buff. For the truly sadistic, there's also Insanity mode, where save stations are completely disabled and you have to beat the whole game in one run. Not really my thing, but be my guest. Speaking of Insanity mode, the community updates added several new modes to play around with. First up is the oddly titled New Game Plus. This mode starts you off with all the lava drained up to the distribution center and allows you to tackle Metroids in the 5 Chozo facilities in any order you want. In practice, you're still limited by the suit upgrades you have, but that still means you can cheese some of the bosses in fusion mode by collecting expansions from later areas. Overall, New Game Plus does indeed offer more freedom in how you want to route the game. Generally speaking, however, I found that sequence breaking and Zero Mission rewarded mastery of advanced techniques with earlier items and faster clear times. With AM2R's New Game Plus, I found that emphasis on finesse wasn't here short of using the IBJ to bypass the space jump. Also, considering how Metroid II and AM2R by extension are designed to go linearly from area to area, and that you must destroy all of the Metroids to reach the end of the game, that essentially makes the original route the fastest one. So, with New Game Plus, you have to go out of your way to make the experience non-linear, and by doing so, you're also making the game longer. I'm not sure what the point is. Don't get me wrong, there's good cheeky fun in discovering that the gravity suit disables certain set pieces in the Hydro Station, or that you can defeat Arachnus with power bombs, though technically I think you can still do those in a normal game. I guess if you really wanted more freedom from Metroid 2 that wasn't there in the original, you'll get what you wanted. If you ask me, the real fun lies with Random Game Plus. This is basically like New Game Plus, only the game will randomize the locations of power-ups, expansions, or both. Randomizers in general have become pretty popular lately, though I don't have much experience with them myself. What I found was that randomized upgrade locations fundamentally change the experience and how you approach exploration. After playing the game vanilla so many times before this, the randomizer did a lot to make the experience feel fresh and was probably my favorite run I recorded for this review. What's nice about the randomizer is that you have a lot of options to play around with. You can choose not to randomize upgrades at all, randomize upgrades and expansions separately, or intersperse upgrades with expansions. The bombs are surprisingly the most valuable upgrade in the whole lot, but the starting paths option will guarantee that the bombs, power bombs, or screw attack will appear in the Golden Temple to make things easier. You can also play with the custom seed if you really want to, but after what RZ put me through, no thanks. I know that's the secret. I've got to be able to spawn the scarecrow from there, I think. What? You did He clipped right through! God help me.
Yeah, you didn't think I was gonna let you off the hook that easy with the seed, eh?
As much as I do enjoy the randomizer, I do have a couple quibbles. First, while it's great that there are so many options, the user experience is somewhat wanting. It's not clear based on the names of the drop-down menus which option does what, and finding out requires digging through the README and an easily missable text file. Next, despite the addition of Septogs, it's still possible to get stuck in morph ball passages and have to restart from the last save if you're not careful. Unfortunately, that's just kind of the nature of the randomizer, so as a player you'll have to be vigilant. Taken on the whole, however, I'd call the randomizer the best of the updates added by the AM2R Community Developers. While I'm at it, I should quickly discuss the Android version of AM2R. For review's sake, I did a quick playthrough on my Samsung Galaxy S6 recording with an app called Screen Copy. I apologize for the footage quality, but this is the best I could manage under the circumstances. Like most side-scrollers on mobile, AM2R uses touch controls by default, which you can adjust to make them more comfortable for your screen or hands. The touch controls are fine for basic movement, jumping, and shooting. I even managed to pull off wall jumps reliably enough. However, because the touch controls are right next to the Recents button, I found myself triggering it by accident during gameplay. Moreover, these tiny triangular buttons are surprisingly difficult to press, meaning that diagonal aiming and toggling the spider ball can be pretty unresponsive. Because of that, the touch controls completely fall apart the moment you're expected to move, jump, and aim in rapid succession, such as during the Metroid Minibosses. Thankfully, the Android version supports controllers, including later Xbox controllers over Bluetooth. From here, the Android version plays about as well as the PC version. It's even fully featured, including fusion mode and the randomizer. The only real problem I could mention is that the game gets really chuggy in underwater areas, especially during the Samus boss. My phone is pretty old, and these areas run fine when I'm not recording, so you might have better luck on your own device. Overall, if you're looking for AM2R on the go, the Android version is certainly that. Just make sure you have a decent controller and you should be good to go. So, remake or rebreak. 5 years after its release, how well does AM2R recreate and improve upon the original Metroid II? For the sake of argument, let's set aside the fact that Samus Returns exists, and pretend it's still 2016 when AM2R originally came out. As a remake, AM2R does everything for Metroid II that Zero Mission did for the NES game. The graphics are a significant upgrade that adds some much needed color, detail, and texture to a game that previously had little of all these things. The visual style is reminiscent of the GBA games, but stands on its own through more impressive backgrounds and an emphasis on darker tones that wouldn't have worked on GBA. On top of that, it reimagines the repetitive tunnels and temples into something more in line with other Metroid games, all the while adding new set pieces and gameplay to match. The story has significantly better presentation, a codex full of Prime-style lore, and even expands on ideas that were previously footnotes in the manual. The V1.2 Soundtrack successfully updates Yoshitomi's Game Boy pieces in the style of Metroid Prime, all the while expanding the track list with familiar melodies and improving the compositions with a more layered texture and a stronger grasp of harmony. The core gameplay carries over all the improvements from Zero Mission and expands on them with numerous quality of life improvements to make the moment-to-moment gameplay the best it's ever been. While the Metroid bosses can get tedious on repeat playthroughs, the overall boss design is a huge improvement over the original game and even Zero Mission, with the overhauled Arachnus and new bosses being particularly standout. Finally, the level design is significantly overhauled to reduce the use of recycled room layouts, expand existing areas with meaningfully new set pieces, and even adds completely new areas to compound what was already there. That's not to mention the more intuitive navigation and the addition of a much needed map feature. The new updates from the community developers add several new features that were planned by the original team but cancelled after the DMCA, all the while future-proofing the game with a new difficulty, a new game plus, and a randomizer. Despite all the changes, AM2R still looks and feels like Metroid II. And this, to me, is the most important difference between this game and Samus Returns. AM2R is a labor of love that deeply respects its inspiration and seeks to draw all the latent potential out of its original. As for Samus Returns, hold that thought. Now, as much as I really do love AM2R, I do have one major complaint that holds it back somewhat. While I enjoy fighting Omegas, I find that the other Metroid mini-bosses range from mildly frustrating to tedious. Even considering the design challenge involved, the Metroids in this game are only a mild improvement over their Game Boy ancestors. After much consideration, I've nevertheless decided to award AM2R with my highest honor: Replace. While I may have given the impression that the difference between a remake and a replace is all or nothing, I still think there's room in the category for a game that gets 98% of the way there. After all, I rated Zero Mission a replace, and that game has some minor flaws. Nevertheless, it still fulfilled all the potential that a remake of the original Metroid realistically could have on Game Boy Advance. Including the original game certainly helped, but AM2R couldn't do that for obvious reasons. Ultimately, I decided on a replay score because I couldn't think of a single thing the original does better besides being able to shoot alphas and gammas in the face. If that's the worst criticism I can muster, then I don't think I can deny a replay score where it's due, especially given how much AM2R improves in virtually every other respect. But then again, it's just an arbitrary subjective ranking, so don't take it too seriously. If what you saw in this review interested you, I can recommend checking out AM2R for yourself, especially if you haven't played the later versions. While the experience is still the same AM2R at its core, the finalized soundtrack, bug fixes, and new game modes make the updates worth checking out. On that note, I'd like to thank lead programmer Loji Miru and the rest of the AM2R community developers for being such a great resource during the production of this review. While this review is complete for the time being, AM2R is still in active development and the community has big plans going forward. So if you're interested in keeping up with the community, check out the AM2R subreddit or the AM2R Discord server. At the end of the day, AM2R is another Metroid II remake and not the official Metroid II remake. Join me next time for part 3 when we look at Metroid Samus Returns for the 3DS. Until then, I'm ExoParadigmGamer and I hope you all enjoyed the review.